Okay, how about we get started? We only have an hour for this webinar, so I want to make sure we're able to hit all the topics today and hopefully leave some time at the end for questions. Welcome to How to Develop a Budget, General Principles and Considerations. We're going to get started with a little bit of housekeeping for you, just to help make sure that everyone has a good experience today as much as possible. We have some tips for you. First, maximize your browser window to make sure that you can see all of the controls. This is especially important if you want to use the closed caption feature. Your audio is controlled by the device you are using to join this webinar. For example, your cell phone or smartphone, desktop computer, or tablet. If you want to experience this on your cell phone or smartphone, you need to send a link to your phone. We do not have a call-in number. Please make sure your device is not muted, and if that doesn't work, please make sure that your broadcast is not paused. Click the space bar or anywhere on the screen to make sure that it's not paused. We're using the Microsoft Teams live event platform due to the audience size. This is basically a broadcast, so you can see us, you can hear us, but we can't see or hear you. The way that you can engage in this training is by using the Q&A panel and click on Ask a Question. That panel is in the upper right corner of your screen. This webinar will be conducted in English, and closed captions are available in Arabic, Chinese, English, Filipino, Spanish, and Vietnamese. On the bottom right corner of your window, click on the CC button to turn on live captions. Use the tool button right next to the CC button to select your language. And just note that these are live captions, so they're not automatically accurate, at least 100% accurate. There might be some words in there that it might not pick up accurately. For now, we will be posting a recorded webinar, and those captions should be more accurate. Lastly, a recording of today's webinar will be made available. It will be on the EPA financial management, or on the EPA budget webpage. And we actually have a link here to the page where we are posting our webinars. So we also have someone helping to answer questions that you put into the Q&A Q&A panel. We may not be able to answer all of your questions today. There are a lot of you, and so if we don't get to your question today, please don't panic. We will be developing an FAQ sheet that we will be posting probably within a couple weeks, and the posting of the webinar will probably take a few weeks as well. So with that, let's get started. So we want to welcome you to this course, your How to Develop a Budget course. This provides an introduction and an overview about the important considerations that you need to be aware of when you're developing your budget. This is generally for project grants, cooperative agreements, continuing environmental program applications and amendments, continuing environmental program, short for that is CEP. And this is also for recipients of Brownfield's revolving loan fund cooperative agreements. But this is not really applicable to the state clean water and drinking water revolving loan fund capitalization grants. So I would say if you're only interested in the state clean water and drinking water revolving loan fund capitalization grants, you may not want to finish attending this webinar. So this is intended to provide just an overview to help you understand basic principles and considerations. We do have more targeted information on budget development, including some calculation exercises, really helping you get into the details of your budgets. So you can see our additional training on direct costs, other direct costs, and indirect costs. Those can be very, very helpful when you're getting kind of into the nitty-gritty of your budget development, and maybe you're not sure what budget categories costs go into, like is this personnel or is this something else? You know, how do we calculate indirect costs? That kind of stuff. We won't be going through that today because it would just be way too much and probably inapplicable to a lot of you. But those are definitely excellent trainings that we have available. I always recommend just, Google EPA grants and go to our homepage, and we have links to all sorts of different training opportunities and policies and guidance and things like that. So it's super helpful. So today's training team, we have Christopher Kent. He is my colleague from the EPA's Office of Grants and Debarment. The acronym for that is OGD. He's a program analyst, and we have his email below. And then my name is Julie Milazzo. I'm also a program analyst in OGD, and my email is here as well if you need to contact us. We're going to keep going. So what is in this course? This module is going to introduce you to the general factors to consider when developing your budget, such as the required forms that need to be submitted, cost allowability, what can your grant pay for, prior approval of costs, you know, what happens if you have something and you don't know if EPA will fund it or not. What are those things that are really important to make sure we approve in advance? Pre-award costs. Those are costs that happen before the grant is even awarded. And we have some pretty specific rules about those. Cost share, you know, if you're going to be providing part of the grant funding yourself. EPA in-kind assistance, that's if we give you something other than money. Pre-award budget revisions, sometimes changes have to happen. You know, you might submit forms and then we come back to you and say, actually, we can't do that, maybe we can do this. Program income, if you're earning money from your grant, and then transferring funds. So we're going to start talking about the required forms that you have to submit when applying for EPA financial assistance agreements. I tend to say the word grant a lot. It's just a colloquial way of talking about it. The proper term is assistance agreements, which means it could be a grant or a cooperative agreement. If it's a cooperative agreement, that means EPA is more substantially involved. We have a little hand in managing and overseeing the grant, or the assistance agreement, whereas a grant, we're pretty hands-off after it's awarded. So the first form is the SF424. That's your basic application form. It contains, you know, basic information. I'm going to blow this up a little bit. This is kind of the top half. You know, is this a new award? Is this a revision? Some of it might auto-populate. You know, what is your federal entity identifier? What is your legal name? Your entity's legal name, your taxpayer number, your UEI. That's a newer thing. So you're going to want to make sure that you're using the most up-to-date version of this. And you can find it in grants.gov. We have a link here to that. You can also go to www.grants.gov and look for application forms. So accompanying that basic form is the SF424A. This is going to contain some of your budget information, and we're assuming it's for non-construction programs. When you're applying for the grant, you'll be advised, you know, if you should be using a non-construction form or a construction form. This is the one we use a majority of the time. And even with the infrastructure funds that are coming, you know, we're as an agency, we're probably likely going to continue to use the non-construction programs form. So this is one that you're going to fill out. It summarizes the project budget. Includes a breakdown of the proposed cost by various categories. It's going to have personnel, fringe, equipment, supplies, contractual, other, indirect if you have indirect costs, program income, things like that. It's not very detailed. Those are just going to be numbers and categories. So in addition to that, you're also going to be submitting a budget table and a budget narrative, because we really need to understand what it is you're proposing to do. And just putting money in categories doesn't really help us understand. So part of it's going to be if you plan to have 5 people employed on your grant, you know, what are their job titles? How many hours are they working? What is their salary? Things like that. So those other forms will get into more detail on what you're doing. And of course, all of those roles and the time that they're dedicating to doing those roles then also needs to tie into the scope of work. So, you know, we don't want to see that like you have an astronaut as a full-time employee, and then, you know, there's nothing related to an astronaut in your work plan. I don't think we would ever have an astronaut in any of our grants, but it's just an example. So, you know, we really want to make sure it all makes sense and ties together. So again, you can go to grants.gov to view the SF424A and download it. Common Forms SF424C. This is the one for construction programs. It gets pretty in depth, and that's really for, you know, huge infrastructure projects that we have. Again, it's rarely used, so I would definitely check, you know, with the EPA if you see a funding opportunity or something. You know, make sure that you're not picking out this form randomly instead of the SF424A, because this has a lot more to fill out and you're not going to want to do it. So if you are able to use the SF424A, in most cases you will be able to definitely pick that one. But in some cases you may not have a choice. You may have to do this. In those cases, again, you're going to have to also submit the project budget, and a breakdown of the proposed construction costs by those same categories: your personnel, your fringe, equipment, supplies, contractual, other, all those. So it's very similar, just the forms look a bit different. And again, you're going to have to let us know how each cost relates to the goal. So, you know, if you're doing a construction program and, you know, we're seeing costs that are absolutely not associated with construction, then, you know, we'll probably be asking you about those. Okay, we are going to move on to cost allowability and prior approval of costs. This is the general discussion of basic principles of what we allow, and then what are some things that EPA requires you to get prior approval from us for. So hopefully you're getting yourself familiar with 2 CFR Part 200. Those are the federal regulations that govern all federal grants. So this is something that you definitely need to be familiar with, whether you're applying for EPA grants or grants from another federal agency. We're required to follow them. You're required to follow them. In particular, for cost allowability, though, we have a subpart E, and that's something that we look at if we're trying to figure out, you know, maybe we get an application, we're just not sure if what the applicant is proposing is allowable. We'll look at the cost principles to see what they have to say about it. So the cost principles can help us figure out if specific things are eligible, you know, permitted by statute, regulation, or program guidance. If they're reasonable, if they don't exceed what a prudent person would spend money on. So if you think about a responsible person in your life, maybe that's you, maybe that's not you, it's not me. But, you know, think of your most responsible friend. Would they think that this is a good use of the money? And if not, it may not be reasonable. And I actually have an example I'll share as we kind of get a little bit more in depth on all of these. Allocable, so you're either incurring the cost directly or indirectly to carry out the scope of the work. And then just overall allowability, are you allowed to charge these to EPA assistance agreements? In some cases, there might be some costs that are prohibited for a particular program, so you really need to know what those are. So an example for eligible costs, things like if you're doing a training program, if you're offering training as part of your grant, there's no way we're going to let you buy land or have construction costs. You know, you're not building a building to do this training. So those are things that we really look for. You know, what is this grant for? And then are the costs that you're proposing in alignment with what this grant is for? Some program offices might have guidance as well to help you make some decisions. Maybe they get certain questions about types of costs all the time, and so they have addressed it in program guidance. Yes, you can do this. No, you really can't do that. So it's always good to read the program guidance if it's available. And then also, once you get your award, if you do receive an award, there are terms and conditions, and it's really important to read those. I know I never read terms and conditions like that come with my smartphone or any of that stuff. But in this case, it's really important because those terms and conditions obligate you to do things. You're agreeing by accepting the award and its terms and conditions. You are agreeing that you're going to fulfill those things and that you're not going to do other things. So make sure you're aware of what those terms and conditions are so that you don't end up getting on the wrong side of your grant. I have an example that we can kind of go. I'll take you through all of these. But so I started out as a grant specialist more than 13 years ago at this point. And I had a grant applicant who they wanted to put together a newsletter talking about recycling. They were starting a new recycling program, and they really wanted to make sure people were aware of it. And I kind of got a little bit of a red flag because the costs were really high. I think they wanted maybe $8,000 to put together a newsletter. And it just seemed very expensive. And then when I contacted them to talk about it a little more, it turned out, really it was only going to go to 140 people. Many people, sorry about that. It's got a mind of its own. Many people don't live alone. And so really it probably only needed to be mailed to a few households. And so when you start really looking at like, well, who it's going to, is there another way of doing this? Is this the best use of the funds? Yes, they were eligible. They were allowed to do outreach materials as part of the grant. That was fine. But then, we get to this next piece, the reasonable costs. And I would not feel comfortable spending $8,000 on a newsletter that wasn't actually going to reach that many people. And I think at the end, they were able to use most of that money for something more beneficial to them. They were able to just put a few flyers around in, the local grocery store and things like that. So, we do look for things like that where maybe, yeah, sure, it's eligible, but it's not reasonable. So another example is purchasing vans. So you're giving a conference, maybe a 3-day conference. You're not going to buy a bunch of vans to transport people. We're not going to let you buy a bunch of vans to transport people. We're going to have you look into hiring a transportation company, and we'll cover those costs. Maybe you get a bus and a driver for a few days if needed, but you're not buying that bus for a 3-day conference or anything like that. So these are things that we pay attention to. Also, salary costs. If you have someone who's maybe working half the time on an EPA grant and half the time they're otherwise employed by you, and maybe they're making $60 an hour when they're employed by you, but you want them to make $150 when they're employed by the EPA. Those are some red flags. They really should be compensated at the same rate if they're doing the same work, regardless of who's paying for it. So it would not be reasonable for us to basically give them a 150% raise or something like that. So just some tips to pay attention to. So allocable costs, these need to be able to be allocated to your grant. So many of you may just do all direct costs. Some of you might have indirect costs as well if you have an indirect cost rate. And so you really need to track those costs. And if you're charging them to the EPA grant directly, they aren't things that can also be covered by your indirect costs. So for example, if you have 3 EPA grants that you're running out of the same office and you have an indirect cost rate so that maybe there's like a chunk of a third and a third and a third from each grant covering rent and things like that, we're expecting that to be covered by your indirect cost rate if that's what it's supposed to cover. You can't also then charge additional rent directly. That's kind of double dipping. So you need to make sure that you're really tracking and accounting for all of your expenses where they belong and only once per grant. It can't be direct and indirect charges. And then allowable costs. there are things that we will never ever fund, like alcoholic beverages, interest on borrowed funds, lobbying or litigation. You know, we can't pay for those things. In fact, alcoholic beverages, at least as of 2014, and I don't think this has gotten any looser. If you look at the cost principles for alcoholic beverages, I don't believe we pay for even events where alcohol is served. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you're planning to have a conference and maybe you want to charge, or you want to offer some beer or wine while there's a speaker, you know, during dinner or something, we won't be paying for that event. So it's just really good to understand what we can and can't do. And a lot of the stuff it can be a bit nuanced. So again, those cost principles can really help you out. We have some things that they require EPA approval. A lot of the time, this approval will be in the form of a grant award or a grant amendment. So something in writing from the EPA. I would say always get it in writing, always, because that can help protect you if you're ever audited. You know, if there's no record of approval or proper approval, then you could end up having to pay those costs back. But there's a pretty long list of items that require prior EPA approval in 2 CFR 200-407. Just a small amount of these are purchasing of equipment. You know, equipment is an item that is worth $5,000 and lasts for longer than a year. If you want to purchase equipment, you have to get in writing from the EPA that it's okay, and generally it will be in the form of an amendment or an award. Entertainment costs, you know, we want to be careful about that and make sure that it is necessary for the grant. It's not an absolute no, but it is something that we will want to check into to make sure it's actually allowable, and that's why we're saying it needs prior approval. Travel costs, you know, that needs to be in your budget. We want to know, you know, how much is the plane ticket? How much is the hotel? Are you renting cars? Who's going? We want to know the purpose of their travel. You know, if there's nothing in your work plan that shows us why travel might be necessary, then that's not something that we can support. It really needs, any travel needs to be necessary for the grant. Goods and services for personal use, that is also something that requires EPA prior approval. And again, you have to have descriptions of all these things, and it has to make sense to us, and it has to be allowable. You know, you can't just stick it in the budget and hope we don't notice. We'll be asking questions. And if you did include stuff in your budget and then EPA comes back and says, no, you really need to remove this or change this, there's information on revising budget and program plans in 2 CFR 1500.9. Those are EPA specific regulations. So if you want to get EPA, a prior EPA approval, you're going to consult with your PO before including any costs that require prior approval in your work plan or budget narrative. It's always good to have the conversations up front because it can be a lot of work developing, you know, all these documents that you'll be submitting. And so if it's going to be a no at the end, it's really good to find that out up front. And also they might have alternatives that you wouldn't know to consider because of their experience, you know, doing grants over and over and over. Your PO may have seen it all or knows someone who's seen it all. So it's really good to consult with them. If you have anything that needs prior approval, you know, talk to them before you write anything down, and then make sure you write it down. If they say, yes, we can support that, make sure you get it in writing. Your grant specialist can also provide guidance on obtaining prior approval after award. You know, maybe we awarded an assistance agreement to you, and now you're like, oh, but actually, you know, this changed, and maybe we want to do this instead, or maybe we need to add this to really do it well. You know, talk to your grant specialist, talk to your project officer. Grants can be amended if it makes sense to do so, and that is the way to get prior approval if needed. So, you know, once you get your award, it's not always set in stone, but I wouldn't do anything that needs prior approval until you get it set in stone again and agreed upon, approved, signed off signed off of by EPA, make sure you keep that record, that written record. We do have a guidance on selected items of cost for recipients, so it does provide, a bit more information on things like conferences and food and beverages. I think about like a decade ago, there was an article that came out about like a $12,000 muffin or something ridiculous. And so there was a bit of a crackdown on what can be funded under grants. So we're really careful about that kind of thing at this point. And if you are applying for a competitive grant and have questions about prior approval, reach out to the point of contact that's listed in your request for applications. That's RFA is the acronym. Don't wait until after you've submitted your application. Definitely figure out what you can apply for, what EPA can fund beforehand, because it's important to know that going into a competition. And with this, I'm turning the presentation over to Christopher Kent, my colleague, who's going to talk to you about pre-award costs. Chris, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Appreciate it. I'm going to get into some pre-award costs. All right, so right off the bat, what are pre-award costs? Well, pre-award costs are incurred in anticipation of an award and are necessary for the efficient and timely performance of the project's scope of work. Continuing environmental program grants commonly include pre-award costs to ensure the continued operation of those programs. So there's some considerations you have.
Oh, I can't hear you, Chris.
I have been on mute the whole time. I hit it
twice.
No.
Okay. Just for 2 seconds. Just for 2 seconds. Right. You're fine.
All right. Well, all right. I'll start off with the considerations. I think I left off there. There's 4 of them that you should know. Pre-award costs are incurred prior to the award date, but on or after the start date of the budget project period. Pre-award costs also are incurred more than 90 days prior to the award date or only allowable with written approval. So you have to make sure your dates are really set in stone and correct. Pre-award costs must be included in the application and the work plan, so we have to know about them. They have to be in the plan. Pre-award costs are incurred at the applicant's own risk. This is important. There's no guarantee you'll get the award. So if you have pre-award costs, it's going to be at your own risk. Thank you, Julie. So what costs incurred prior to the award? Well, to receive EPA approval, all eligible costs must be incurred during the budget project period, which is that start and end date of the grant award. Generally, the budget period and the project period and the grant agreement are the same, and they should reflect around the same period of the grant application. It might differ, and some grant awards may have been delayed, or the EPA PO might have negotiated a change. So always, and I will harp on this all day and all night, consult with your project officer or grant specialist if you have any questions about the pre-award costs. They're there to help you, so don't be afraid to reach out. Now, all right, let's get some fun cost share, aka matching, and EPA in-kind assistance. So what are those, you might be asking? Well, many EPA programs require grant applicants to provide a cost share, aka matching funds, of a certain percentage of the total costs of the grant project or a percentage of the federal share. Costs that you intend to count towards meeting a cost share requirement must be necessary and reasonable, allowable, allocable, and eligible. All things Julie brought up recently, just prior to me getting on. So that's important. You have to meet all those necessary steps. Costs also included in an EPA agreement may not be charged to any other EPA agreement, nor a financial assistance agreement with another federal agency, or included in your indirect cost rate to qualify as a cost share. Generally, the use of federal funds to meet cost share requirements for EPA grants is not allowed. However, and always there are excuse me. However, and always there are exceptions. If you intend to use federal funds to meet cost share requirements, then you must provide supporting documentation showing that it's allowed. We need proof that you can do that. So what's allowable in cost sharing? Well, you must include all the cost sharing in your EPA approved budget or categorize contributions toward cost share required by statute, regulation, or the terms of an assistance agreement in the appropriate budget category in that SF 424A form. So this would be under personnel, contractual, equipment, supplies, indirect. This is just so the EPA can easily verify the allowability. For example, if you do not intend to charge the EPA assistance agreement for all the time your employees spend working on the EPA assisted project, you may include their salaries or wages in that personnel category for cost share purposes. All right, now volunteers. Everyone likes a good volunteer. So volunteer services, uncompensated services provided by people outside your organization, they can be counted as cost sharing or matching if the service is integral and necessary to the approved project or program. Volunteer services that count towards cost shares must be included in that other category on that SF 424A, and it should be valued based on the work that the volunteer performs. So for example, if they're going to be doing some sample work, the contribution should be valued based on the hourly market rates for employees of sampling firms or government employees performing sampling, not like the wage to get paid at the regular job. Back to Julie's example with the astronaut, if the volunteer is an astronaut, then you're not going to base the cost share, the volunteer services off the astronaut wage. You're just going to do it off the, like I said, sampling firms or government employees. All right, so volunteer cost shares, a different thing, but still applicable, are offered by applicants for competitive assistance agreements. It must be in your F24A form again. Remember that these cost shares are binding, and that's important. Voluntary cost shares are binding. EPA program offices that are willing to accept voluntary cost shares will include a notice to that effect in the competitive announcement. So you'll see those two things. They'll be binding and they'll be put in the competitive announcement. Voluntary cost shares are a form of leveraging that may be only met with eligible and allowable costs. So if you have EPA grant to clean up a site, you may leverage funds for housing at the site after the cleanup is complete. The funding of the housing is leveraged, but not a cost share because housing is not an eligible cost under the EPA grant. And so you'll have to explain how an EPA award can leverage funds from other sources for related activities beyond your scope of work. All right, so EPA in-kind assistance. EPA in-kind assistance is a support to an agreement that is provided by 9 non-financial contributions. In-kind can be forms of goods, services, or labor. An applicant may request in-kind assistance, or the EPA may decide to offer that type of assistance in lieu of a direct financial contribution. This is at the EPA's discretion. EPA in-kind assistance may be provided as part of a grant award or EPA personnel under Intergovernmental Personal Act assignments or interagency agreements. In-kind assistance provided by EPA is different than in-kind contributions an applicant contributes or obtains from third parties for the purposes of meeting a cost share requirement. So that's an important one to note. And so how do you get an in-kind assistance? What are the requirements? Well, these should be, first of all, included on your SF 424 and assigned to the appropriate cost category on the 424A. For example, if the EPA purchases equipment that will be delivered to you as EPA in-kind assistance, the cost for those items should be placed in the equipment category. On the other hand, if EPA provides in-kind technical services through an EPA contractor, or these should be put in the contractual category. Note, only authorized EPA personnel may assign tasks to EPA contractors. So it has to come down from EPA. Now, how do we calculate these in-kind assistance? It can be difficult, but it's not too troublesome. Cost share requirements are calculated based on the amount of in-kind assistance in addition to the requested EPA funds. So it's an added on. You must acknowledge the amount and purpose of the in-kind assistance by including the estimated amount in your budget request. You can't count this towards your cost share, unfortunately. All right, so we'll get some budget revisions. I think we'll switch back over to here. So considerations for pre-award budget revisions. There's a need to make changes to your budget after it's submitted to the EPA. You put something in the wrong column or the categorization was wrong. As always, like I said earlier, contact your project officer or grant specialist to make documents of these revisions. If the revision impacts the amount of the award, match, or EPA in-kind assistance, you'll also have to submit a revised SF424. And along with this, chances are you'll have to revise the Section B budget categories of that 424A form, budget narrative, and just any budget-related documents so they're consistent with the approved budget and the award agreement. Some additional considerations. All right, so these are a few things. For state and tribal non-competitive continuing environmental program grants, pen and ink changes to applicant budgets may be acceptable. This means that the EPA is able to make a change to existing applicant forms rather than having to go through the whole process of getting new ones, provided they meet certain conditions, which you can find at the policy issuance below. There's a few of them, but they'll help you out. So Julie, I think that's all I have.
All right, great. Thank you so much. All right, so moving on. We're now going to talk about program income and how we manage it under EPA grants. First of all, what is program income? It's defined as gross income directly generated by an EPA-supported activity or income that's earned as a result of an EPA award during the period of performance. Some examples are fees for services, like conference or training registration fees, sales of products that were produced with EPA funds, loan interest payments from loans an applicant will make with EPA funds. So in some cases, we will provide assistance agreements like to states. They'll then take that money to provide loans to municipalities and other local governments, maybe to do like water treatment plants or something like that. And then they pay back the state with a low interest rate. So those interest payments can count as program income. If program income will be generated under your project, you need to document that on line 7 of your SF424A budget. And you also have to account for it in your forecasted cash needs in line 13 of the SF424A budget form as well. We actually encourage our applicants and recipients to earn program income to help defray the program costs. It's actually a really good thing if you want to earn some income. So you can see 2 CFR Part 200 307 for more information on that. Some things that are not program income are proceeds from the sale of items purchased with EPA funds like real property, equipment, and supplies. So again, program income is income earned during the period of performance of your grant. So, if you're applying for a grant and you say we need 5 computers to do, to carry out the work plan, and then month 1 you sell all 5 of those computers to get program income, we're not going to allow that because those computers needed to be purchased, for use on the actual grant, not just to be sold to make money. So also transactions in which previously expended EPA funds are recouped, like refunds and rebates, that's not program income. And then governmental revenues like fines and special assessments, we don't consider those program income. And permit fees that are generated by state, tribal, or local environmental programs, those are considered governmental revenues, not program income. And if your organization receives more than 50% of its annual revenue from EPA, consult with your PO if you plan to charge membership fees for exclusive services using EPA award funds or matching funds. Another example of program income that I saw a lot actually when I was a grant specialist was recycling of scrap metal. And I'm guessing right now scrap metal is kind of a hot commodity as well, so that could be an example of program income. So there are 3 ways of dealing with program income. The first is addition, and this is EPA's preferred method. This is where, say, for example, you're applying for an EPA grant for $100,000. and you plan to get program income, maybe $5,000. You're planning to have a conference, you have registration fees, so you're expecting to get $5,000. That can be added to the EPA's $100,000. So now overall it's $105,000 for this grant. And that is what we actually default to. We want to reward you for generating program income. That's why it's our method. And you'll have terms and conditions that go along with it, telling you that it can be used and it should be used for activities in the grant, allowable EPA activities. You can't take that $5,000 and go buy several kegs and have a party. But if you are planning on generating any program income, ensure that your budget narratives contains a clear description of the planned use of the program income. Ensure that your accounting systems are able to track that as program income. That must be, kind of kept separate from the EPA funds. We need to know what it's being spent on. And so it's just important to make sure you have accounting systems in place to manage that. There's also the deduction method. This is not one that we favor. But an example of the deduction method is, again, we're giving you a $100,000 grant and you think you're going to be pulling in $5,000. And now we're like, okay, great. We were going to give you 100,000. Now we're only giving you 95,000 because you're making up the other 5,000. So that is not one that we favor, and that's not what we default to. And then there's also cost share. So you can use your program income as cost share as well. That has to be properly documented and all of that stuff. The issue with cost share is, any cost share that's included in the award, that is binding. So whether you started it out as voluntary cost share or it's program income and that you want to include as cost share, once we've made that award, you are now obligated to provide that cost share. So say, a pandemic hits and now you have to cancel your conference and that program income, isn't going to come in anymore, but you had it in your award as cost share. That's a problem. And that's not a problem that you would have had if you had, used it in the addition method. And so that's another reason we prefer addition, because it's just less messy if things go awry. You can't always guarantee that you're going to make that program income. And so I would say if you're ever in a situation, though, where, your anticipated program income is not going to happen, you have the award, somehow it's in the budget and it's not able to happen, that's a good time to talk to your project officer and your grant specialist to see what to do about it. And probably the addition method would be the easiest one for them and for you to deal with. So just have those conversations, always have those conversations. As soon as you notice a problem might be happening, don't wait. So you might have, say you have a conference coming and EPA is paying for half of it and the other half of it's being paid for by other methods. You're basically going to prorate your program income. So in that case, if you're anticipating 5,000 in revenue from this event, since EPA paid for half of it, half of that will be considered program income that you make. So, 2,500 instead of the full 5,000 would be considered program income for your EPA grant. So just keep aware of that. If we're not paying for the whole thing, you're going to have to figure out what portion we're paying for and have your program income be commensurate with that. You may be able to use the other part as cost share, but for the additive method, for sure, it would only be the part that EPA is funding. Okay, so program income after the award is over. So after the award period, you're done with your grant, closing out or closed out, but you're done with the performance period and the budget period. There really aren't any federal regulations on the use of program income earned after an award period ends, unless there's an EPA regulation of some sort or the terms and conditions of your agreement. Maybe there will be something in the terms and conditions. So again, read them. But there's really nothing regulatory saying what has to happen after the end of an award if you're still making money, that was generated based on your EPA grant. So, again, check your closeout agreement, check your terms and conditions of your award just to make sure you're aware of what those requirements are, if there are any, but there might not be any. Okay, last, transferring funds. We're going to review factors to consider when transferring funds. This is an area that I would say I am the least proficient in, and that is very much because a lot of this depends on your procedures, your internal procedures, not EPA. So we're going to go over some options, but a lot of it is, if you have any questions, the answer is absolutely going to be, it depends. And it's really going to just depend on how you are set up. So these are very general, may not be applicable to everyone. But depending on your state, tribal, or local law, transfers of funding between departments or agencies of the same governmental unit may be interagency service agreements. So as an example, say we give a grant to a Department of Environmental Conservation. That Department of Environmental Conservation may then further parse out those funds to other departments. So depending on how you're structured and how you document these things, you may consider it an interagency service agreement, and distribute your funding as direct costs, subawards, or procurement contracts. That's really up to you and your organization. If you are a government applicant, make sure you work with your project officer and grant specialist to ensure that the budgets are structured appropriately to characterize where those costs should go. Maybe the bucket that a certain cost goes into is going to be dependent on your agency or your entity. So it's very individual, very particular to you and your entity. An example is separate budgets might be needed, encompassing both direct and indirect costs for each department's share of an EPA award or transactions might be characterized as subawards. But again, it's going to be under your state, tribal, or local law, most likely. We are flexible about that because we understand that it needs to fit in with you, your accounting systems, your procedures, that kind of thing. So we can also classify transactions between agencies as procurement contracts. So we give you a grant and then maybe you parse it out as procurement contracts. Maybe you're further giving money to another state agency for part of it, maybe a Department of Health or something that's not even part of your own agency. So that may end up being classified as contractual, again, based on your own laws. And then we have a subaward policy additional resources page that there's a lot of information in there. So, if you are in a situation where you need to transfer some funds to other departments or other agencies once you get our grant, it would be a good idea to familiarize yourself with that policy and the additional resources now. If you do provide separate budgets for each department, the EPA award document should include different budget worksheets for each one receiving EPA funds, but they may end up being consolidated into one at the time of award. It just depends on EPA, the practice of that region or EPA headquarters, but there should be some record maybe outside of the award with that breakdown so everyone is aware. And if you characterize the funding transfers as subawards, that does need to be in the other cost category. The other is sort of a bucket where we put things that don't really fit into any of the other categories. And then if you do that, if you decide to subaward, that's basically like you're giving a grant to a different entity, then you have to comply with the requirements for pass-through entities at 2 CFR 200 Part 331 if it's going to be a subaward. So there are going to be some extra strings attached if you are awarding it kind of as your own grant to another entity rather than like an interagency transfer of some sort. Institutes of Higher Education Fund transfers. So transfers of funds between departments of the same institute of higher education, those are also going to be governed by the institution's internal policies and procedures. So we don't consider these subawards or procurement contracts, but you might. So again, this is something, if you are planning to further award out or transfer money out of your department, it's a good idea to talk to your PO, your grant specialist, make sure that you are getting those costs into the right cost categories, describing them accurately, and make sure you're familiar with the subaward policy. But again, so much of this is going to be just really particular to your entity, so it's hard to go into depth on any of these topics. With that, we have actually made it to the end, and really good timing. Just very quickly, we're going to go over what you've learned in this module. So we went over the required forms. Those are in grants.gov. Cost allowability, and that's the whole, is it reasonable? Would a prudent person allow this? Eligible, allocable, necessary. Prior approval, make sure you get in writing, usually in the form of a grant award or amendment. You need something from the EPA for prior approval of costs. It will protect you. Pre-award costs, those are costs that happen before the grant is awarded to you. So maybe you start something a little early, but as Chris mentioned, there's no guarantee that you're going to get an award until you get the award. So if you spend money in anticipation of an award, that may be on you if the award doesn't come through. Cost share is you're contributing some funds to the grant. EPA in kind assistance is we're giving you something other than money. Pre-award budget revisions, that's just part of the negotiations with your project officer or grant specialist. You might have to make some changes to some documents. Program income is if you're going to be making money using EPA grant funds, and then transferring funds is once you get the award, you're going to move it out of your department, at least some of it, elsewhere. So this is really kind of the starting point for training. For more targeted information, again, we have these links to the direct costs training, other direct costs, indirect costs. I highly recommend these three. Again, they have exercises, hands-on exercises to help you get a little bit mathy with it, and it's really excellent training. We want to say thank you very much for attending this. We have a couple resource pages, and then we can get to hopefully some questions. I'm hoping you haven't given us anything too hard, but we'll see. So this is just a list of links to the different regulations we went over. So you'll see cost principles in here and other ones just to help you. It's all consolidated there. Some guidance documents that we mentioned that can be helpful to you as you're navigating applying for grants and budgeting for grants. Everybody's favorite, the acronyms. I tried hard not to use too many of them, but these are some pretty common ones. And so it's just helpful to have these in mind. And then I'm gonna, let's see. And then we'll answer some questions, but I've got our email addresses up. Quick warning, my day ends in about 7-ish minutes and I won't be back until Tuesday. So if you have any questions for me, just know that they won't be answered immediately, but that I will get to them. We will be putting out an FAQ sheet as a result of the Q&A from today. So, hopefully we'll be able to answer your questions. If we weren't able to answer them today, again, tons of you, not many of us. And also, we're not all in-depth experts on every one of these things. But so if we weren't able to answer questions today, we're going to look at getting them into the FAQ for everyone so that this information is available to everyone. Again, we will be posting a recording of this webinar within a few weeks. We'll be posting that FAQ. We will be posting this presentation or a PowerPoint version so you can go through it on your own. And there's excellent in-depth training for you as well. So with that, hopefully I'm going to give everyone about a minute to to write down our email addresses if you want them. You may never want to have contact with us again. That's understandable too. This was a lot of information, but you know, hopefully this can be helpful to you if needed. So I'm gonna just make my screen a little smaller and pop over to the Teams live event so that we can discuss any Q&As that we might need to talk about. Let's see here. And Alex or Chris, if you have any that you think, you know, if you think you want to ask and answer any of these questions too, feel free. Okay, seeing some. I actually don't know the answer. We have one. We stipend residents involved in sampling. How does EPA consider that? So stipends are, I believe, going to be very dependent on your entity. It might depend on how you classify them, but I do believe that we generally do allow for stipends. They would have to have been in your award though. So part of your budget, part of the award document, and I would talk to your project officer and grant specialist about that, just to make sure that they get categorized accurately. Let's see, I'm going to go over to published questions. Yes, okay. So is there any training or webinars for developing the actual budget table and where to find accurate rates? So we do have, there are 4 trainings available. I sent you links to 3. This one that we just gave is actually almost entirely based on the first one. It's the general principles one. So we do have those other 3 will help you with hands-on exercises to help you get comfortable with budgeting and figure out, you know, does this belong in this category? What if we want to do this kind of a thing? You know, those trainings are excellent. They were recently done, and I highly recommend taking those. They will walk you through developing the actual budget with the cost categories, the money, help you with the calculations, figuring all that stuff out. And it's great because you can do it on your own time, and you know, spend some time with it and get comfortable and refer back to it easily. And we also do have general budget development guidance, and that can also help provide guidance about, like, you know, if you want to do this thing, you know, where would that belong in the budget? You know, what category? If you're not sure if something is, you know, maybe you have, say, an administrative assistant who is going to be working on this grant, but is also going to be working on a bunch of other stuff, so she's only part-time. You know, maybe she's part of your indirect cost pool, or he's part of your indirect cost pool. And if so, then you can't charge directly for that administrative assistant's time. You know, things like that. There are more considerations. Let's see, we are running out of time. Why isn't my little thingy working? Having a hard time scrolling. Alex, did you see any that you think we need to address that you can see? I'm not able to see many of these. Oh, here we go. Okay, what would trigger the need for a post-award budget revision? So our moderator wrote, it depends, but if you have questions regarding a post-award budget revision, contact your grant specialist. So yes, very true. Always talk to your grant specialist. Really, when we covered those prior approval items, you know, things that require EPA to have to put in writing that yes, you can do this. If you have any new things like that that weren't in your award, you're going to need to, you know, maybe do a budget revision, stuff like that. Or if you're finding that, you know, we got an award to do this, for example, the conference again, we got an award to put on a huge conference and then COVID hits. You can't do the conference anymore, but you maybe have $50,000. If you want to do something else with that $50,000 instead of the conference, you're probably going to have to do a post-award budget revision, you know, change your scope of work, and you basically would be applying for an amendment to your award. So now you're off the hook for the conference, you're doing this other thing, but EPA, and you have to do all the things to make sure that all of those new costs are approvable. Make sure that removing the conference from your scope of work doesn't, derail everything else that you planned to do. You're really going to look at it holistically. But things like that, where it's, your current budget isn't working, and for whatever reason you need to change things around, but you've already been given the award. And I know we're at 12. I see a lot of answers, to help, that like basically providing links to the additional trainings and some guidance. So definitely take those trainings. When we'll post this presentation with links to those trainings and guidances and the regulations, all those things. So hopefully this was helpful. I know it was an hour and it's a lot of information, so I hope it wasn't too much, but we really, really do appreciate your attendance. Christopher Kent, great job. Appreciated your piece of this presentation. Alex Raver, thank you so much for answering questions behind the scenes for us. You are wonderful. And to our contractors who are running this for us, thank you so much.